Today, I'm going to talk to you about an area of cognitive science that is both extremely interesting and extremely important to the field itself and to all of us as people with consciousness. We're going to explore what I call voluntarily entered states of selflessness and the connection between psychedelics and meditation as a direction for future research and understanding into the study of the mind, the self, and consciousness. Why this is important, I hope, will become clear throughout the talk. Voluntarily entered states of selflessness refers to states of conscious selflessness where individuals with relatively normal states of waking consciousness voluntarily choose to undergo a partial disruption or complete dissolution of their self-consciousness. Now, as the loss of self is not a simple one-dimensional construct, this definition accounts for the broad spectrum of selfless experience and the multi-dimensional nature of the self. Don't worry if you don't know what some of these terms mean, I'll explain them as I go. So why psychedelics and meditation? Well, I come from a philosophy background, and philosophy to a large extent is about reason and analysis. Ever since I began studying philosophy, I was captured by this ability to analyze and understand everything through reason and thought. It was just amazing to me that simply through thinking and reasoning, I could come to reach deep and profound truths about the world and myself. As a result of this, I held the belief that everything could be completely understood if you only thought well enough. Well, this same philosophical curiosity led me to psychedelics. You can probably guess how that turned out. I started researching everything I could find to prepare myself and be ready for what I was about to experience. And I went into these experiences with an analytical mind and not a strong understanding of my unconscious self. Well, it didn't take long until this approach no longer worked. As you might expect, I had trouble figuring out the psychedelic experience with rational and analytical thinking alone. Conceptualization with thought only got me so far. And I was kind of thrown into a bit of uncertainty after this. I just didn't know how to make sense of what happened. So naturally, I tried to find answers and I tried to figure out what to do. Eventually, it was suggested to me on Reddit, I think actually, that I should begin meditating. I wasn't really sure how this would work and I was a bit skeptical, but I was willing to give it a try. As it turned out, meditation was what allowed me to realize that I don't always need to think or understand things conceptually and that I can just be. It was in this way that I realized that meditation was the way I could integrate this experience and the way forward if I wanted to continue to learn from these kinds of experiences. So rather than trying to understand everything conceptually with thought and reason alone, I realized there was another domain of understanding. After that, I became partially obsessed with studying psychedelics and spiritual traditions, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. And it became pretty clear to me that an understanding of one lends itself to an understanding of the other. And that if we want to truly understand the psychedelic experience and consciousness for that matter, both as individuals and scientifically, we have to look to meditation and other similar states. So where do we go from here? Well, the natural next step for me, still as a philosopher, was to look through the research in the field and ask myself, where does this insight that I had fit? Well, then I came across the study of selfless states of consciousness, which is an area of cognitive science that's gained a growing interest in recent years with the psychedelic experience as a particular focus. So what are selfless states of consciousness? Well, we're all familiar with altered states of consciousness, one of the most common ones being intoxication from alcohol. In an altered state of consciousness, our ordinary experience of being and perception is changed. A selfless state of consciousness is then an experience where our sense of self is either partially disrupted or entirely gone. But what is this sense of self? Well, one dichotomy that's helpfully used in the literature is between the embodied self and the narrative self. The embodied self refers to this feeling of being a self in our conscious experience from moment to moment, the feeling that there's an I experiencing everything. And the narrative self refers to this reflective construction of our identity over time, the narrative that we tell ourselves about who we are. Most drugs that we're familiar with, those that are embedded in our modern culture, like caffeine and alcohol, don't alter this sense of self. The most prominent examples of selfless states, which are the only known candidates for total selflessness being a complete loss of one's sense of self, are the psychedelic experience, or drug-induced ego-dissolution more broadly, meditation, and lucid dreamless sleep, all of which have been present throughout history across various cultures in spiritual, mystical, and often religious settings. Drug-induced ego-dissolution refers to a reversible loss of one's sense of self and self-world boundaries resulting from the use of certain kinds of drugs. Now, in this case, I'm going to be referring to classic psychedelics, which are your psilocybin mushrooms, LSD, DMT, and mescaline. Meditation refers to practices such as mindfulness and non-dual awareness, commonly in the Buddhist and Hindu traditions, all which aim at reducing one's self-consciousness and the phenomenal character of one's experience through being aware and ceasing to identify with your thoughts, sensations, and feelings. Lucid dreamless sleep refers to states of dream content where states of sleep rather, where dream content is entirely absent, although you're completely aware and lucid. So this is similar to a lucid dream in that you're aware, however, there is no dream content whatsoever. You may have fallen into this kind of state yourself, although there are specific techniques used to induce this form of sleep in Tibetan, Buddhist, and Hindu traditions. In this talk, I'm going to mainly focus on the psychedelic experience as a subset of drug-induced ego dissolution and meditation. So what's happening in the research? Well, there's been an increasing convergence in the literature on selfless states of the selfless states of drug-induced ego dissolution, meditation, and lucid dreamless sleep as promising candidates for future research and the only known candidates for total selflessness, as I mentioned before. And while this is the case, and despite the growing interest in this recently explored field, selfless states have received relatively little attention in scientific studies. In a special issue of Philosophy in the Mind Sciences, published on radical disruptions of self-consciousness just last year, the need for a new research program into this area was identified. Now, this is when, during my research, it became clear to me, what ties these states together? Well, they're all voluntarily entered, albeit differently, via one's own decision. My focus on selflessness then, and the exploration of the phenomenology of the psychedelic experience and meditation in particular, moves away from the comparison with involuntary states such as psychosis and schizophrenia and Cotard syndrome, which so far have been the dominant approach in the literature, and instead moves towards focusing on these voluntary states together and exploring their connection. This voluntary focus will establish a conceptual framework of voluntarily entered states of selflessness that will guide the research towards a better understanding of selflessness, the self, and these specific states, given their neurophysiological, phenomenological, and characteristic similarities that I'll go on to discuss. I'm making the case for an interdisciplinary science that explores the similarities and connections between these states, not only for the sake of our scientific and philosophical understanding, but for the sake of anyone who is even the least bit interested in understanding their mind, their self, and their experience in consciousness more completely. In terms of our lived experience, all we have is our mind, through which we experience everything, and our understanding of who we are and our self, and our place in the world. The sum of our lives and its quality can only ever be measured by where we recognize this quality, in our mind. These voluntarily entered states have been a huge part of human history and our journey to understand the self and live fuller, more meaningful lives. Through the framework of voluntarily entered states of selflessness, we can really begin to explore the nature of these states within a context that makes sense. Why look at voluntarily entered states? Well, as I've just mentioned, each of these states have been voluntarily entered in traditional spiritual practices throughout history for thousands of years to gain a greater understanding of ourself and the world, all by reaching these particular states of consciousness where the self is disrupted. It seems to me, put simply, that this is worth exploring, and that there's a significant difference between these voluntarily entered selfless states and involuntary states. And there's much to learn from studying voluntary states together, not only about the self, but from the wisdom in these ancient practices. This image on the right here is from Arcana International, which is an organization that provides people with the opportunity to undergo the ancient practice of taking classic psychedelics in shamanic rituals in a traditional context. The fact that these practices survive and that people all around the world seek them out is incredible, and in a sense shows that there's something to learn here. A wider understanding of these states through the framework of voluntarily entered states of selflessness would make this knowledge accessible to all of us, those who choose to participate and those who don't. As a relatively recent area of study in cognitive science, the investigation of selfless states is in its early stages of theoretical and empirical understanding. While there's been an increase in research into psychedelics and meditation specifically, there's a need for more controlled studies that investigate self-loss in these states, so that our conceptual understanding of selflessness can be supported by rigorous science that directly underpins the reported phenomenology. This would mean that our understanding of these states themselves and the experiences that people have in their practice could be informed by a strong empirical knowledge backed by science. If we want to understand what's happening in these practices and reintegrate the knowledge and wisdom of such a significant part of our shared history as humans, a research program designed to further their study is required, and one that focuses on their voluntary nature does this. Why is it helpful to look at voluntary states together and not involuntary states? Well, primarily, this comes from an understanding that not all selfless states are the same. Based on the research, the phenomenology of selfless states occasioned by different classes of drugs, meditation, and lucid dreamless sleep, and to a larger extent, involuntary states such as psychosis, are not identical. We then need a conceptual framework of selflessness that acknowledges the characteristic differences between these states and their phenomenology in order to guide the research appropriately. Looking at voluntarily entered states together distinguishes different experiences of selflessness in a way that groups meaningfully similar states together. And I'll get to these similarities in a moment. As well as this, moving towards studying voluntarily entered states of selflessness allows for controlled studies that can more accurately target the underlying mechanisms of selflessness and understand the reported phenomenology compared to the unpredictable and complex nature of studying involuntary selflessness in unhealthy individuals, as you might expect. As a result, by gaining an understanding of the underlying mechanisms of selflessness, we stand to learn more about the neural correlates of the self. Again, looking at these voluntarily entered states gives us the opportunity to understand our fundamental nature and who we are on a deeper level that can be informed by science. Now, a much more interesting reason for why these states should be studied together is the similarities they share in terms of their phenomenology, neurophysiology, and character. Phenomenology refers to the subjective experience itself. Neurophysiology refers to the way these compounds act on our brain networks and neurons, and character here refers to the context surrounding the use of these compounds. In this case, the voluntary nature of taking these substances with the intention of dissolving the self, especially in a traditional context or for spiritual reasons. This characteristic similarity is the clearest and most obvious one, and shows that there's a strong connection between these states just in the context of their use alone. In a paper attempting to bridge the domains of selflessness in meditation and psychedelics, it was found that there's a significant overlap in the phenomenology and neurophysiology of the two. This means that the reports of the experiences of selflessness in both meditation and psychedelics are remarkably similar, and that brain activity during these experiences were also found to be similar, with reductions in activity in areas of the brain responsible for self-referential thought. I'll go into more detail on these points soon. As well as this, research on lucid dreamless sleep has used experienced meditators to attempt to understand selflessness, again showing that there's some commonality in these domains of practice. Evan Thompson, who is a neuroscientist and researcher on meditation, sleep, and consciousness, discusses the claim of certain contemplative traditions, such as Buddhism and Hinduism, that the cognitive state of dreamless sleep can be accessed through meditation. Now, I find this claim particularly interesting as it relates to what I'm discussing as a whole, that these voluntary states share a characteristic similarity, and that all of them, to some extent, aim to reach a similar state of selflessness, which is beginning to be proven by science, as I've just mentioned. Studying these states together through the framework of voluntarily entered states of selflessness then allows the research to move in this direction so that we can further understand these states and their shared similarities. Now, this table here shows the phenomenological overlap, which is from the study that I mentioned just before. Now, here you can see just how similar these states are, enough to justify being studied together so we can understand it more. You can see that both in the psychedelic experience and in meditation, there is a complete loss of one's sense of embodied and narrative self, one's sense of self in the world, and one's understanding of who they are over time, with the exception of phenomenal richness in the psychedelic experience, except for in 5-MeO-DMT, which is a story for another day. Specifically, why is it helpful to look at the psychedelic experience as a voluntarily entered state of selflessness? And what do we stand to learn? Well, primarily, this is due to its unique phenomenal character that's yet to be reflected within a framework of understanding selflessness and the potential for this to be better understood. The psychedelic experience can provide a voluntary, expected, and temporary disturbance in self-consciousness of otherwise relatively healthy individuals. This and the fact that overwhelming evidence of self-reports indicate a difference between the phenomenology of drug-induced ego-dissolution in the psychedelic experience and selfless states associated with mental illness, most notably in the positive affect of these experiences, shows that the psychedelic experience needs to be studied in a context and a framework that reflects its own unique character. While it's been helpful up to this point, characteristically different states of selflessness may have little phenomenal or conceptual relevance in furthering their study alongside each other. Now, this is especially interesting to note given the history of the study of classic psychedelics. Having been originally understood within the psychothermomedic model, classic psychedelics were first thought to mimic the symptoms of psychosis, before they were understood more appropriately within the psychedelic model as mind manifesting, and their true nature was properly acknowledged, as vague or non-specific as this description may be. Though it's this vagueness and all that we don't know about psychedelics and their ability to dissolve the self that requires a framework that accurately reflects its unique character and nature, which is the first step and the starting point in coming to understand the often called ineffable nature of these experiences. So what about meditation? Well, as I mentioned earlier, studies have shown similar changes in brain activity in experienced mindfulness meditators and those undergoing high-dose psychedelic experiences, with reductions in areas in the brain responsible for self-referential thought. One of the most significant aspects of meditation is its ability to occasion selflessness. And in some ways, this can properly be described as the aim of meditation. So a framework aiming to understand meditation should reflect this, which voluntarily entered states of selflessness does, by focusing on understanding this alongside relevantly similar states. In doing so, we might also come to further understand this connection between the psychedelic experience and meditation, and the ability of meditation to re-engage one with the insights and lessons experienced through the psychedelic experience. And this goes beyond science. Meditation may come to play an increasingly significant role in the integration of the psychedelic experience in therapeutic and personal contexts, improving our understanding of these states, their connections, and how they can be most beneficially used. It's important to emphasize the significance of an interdisciplinary approach here, which is the direction required if we want to understand meditation or the psychedelic experience beyond a scientific understanding. This is again where bridging the gap between philosophical work on meditation and neuroscience is important, as Evan Thompson has begun to do. Acknowledging meditation as a voluntarily entered state of selflessness alongside other similar states allows the research to head in this direction. Well, what might the future look like with an established interdisciplinary study of voluntarily entered states of selflessness? We'll see more studies attempting to bridge the gaps between meditation, psychedelics, and dreamless sleep, and science, philosophy, and spirituality. And we can begin to provide a rich and deep understanding of these states, their practices, and their profound nature. From a personal, spiritual, or therapeutic level to understanding the nature of the self more broadly, a greater understanding of these states will improve our ability to know ourselves and meaningfully interact in the world, ultimately being able to lead fuller, happier lives and get back in touch with these ancient practices and wisdom that have been so important to us as people historically. These books here are some examples of what interdisciplinary studies like the ones I've mentioned might look like. Each of these have their own unique disciplinary approach and offer deep and fascinating insights, perspectives, and knowledge, all contributing to our understanding of these selfless states. Voluntarily entered states of selflessness will then provide the framework for more of this and more exploration of the true nature of these states. There's clearly something to the connection between the psychedelic experience and meditation, although we've got a long way to go if we want to understand this more. In Terence McKenna's final interview, he said that we are on the brink of a fusion of Western science with quote unquote Eastern mysticism. Nothing mystical about it, except that we call it mysticism. But the fusion of these two viewpoints is going to give us a complete understanding of the universe of space, time, matter, and energy. While we may not reach such an ambitious goal, it's clear that a fusion between the Eastern understanding of the self and the Western understanding of science is the path towards a more complete understanding of who we are as individuals and our place in the world, and our ability to lead fuller, more happy lives. Thank you.